Right, moving from one contentious issue to another, research misconduct. I can think of no one better than to talk to us about this than Peter Wilmshurst. At Christmas, the BMJ awarded him the first ever BMJ Editors Award, which was for, I can't remember, courage and persistence in speaking truth to power. Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you about research misconduct in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. I haven't seen many of these declarations of conflicts of interest, but cardiologists are used to them. But unusually for a cardiologist, mine are all negative. That's to say, I'm not saying I've no conflicts of interest. I'm just saying that every time I've been involved with industry, I've lost money because I've been sued, I've turned down bribes, and turned down consultancy fees because they'd represent a conflict of interest. And interestingly, the chief financial officer of the company, whose offer of a £50,000 consultancy fee I turned down, said, when I met him a year or two later, he said, the company and none of their executives had ever come across a doctor who had turned down a consultancy fee on the grounds that it was a conflict of interest because they were doing research. Pharmaceutical companies have ethical responsibilities as businesses to make a profit and declare a shareholder dividend. They're not required to sell consumers the best product for them, and we tend to forget that. Many of us would like that to be the case. It isn't the case. For me, the real scandal is that regulators fail to prevent the misconduct by industry, and that doctors, institutions, and journals that have responsibilities to patients and scientific integrity collude with industry for financial gain. And what I want to do is present to you some very low quality evidence, because this is based on anecdotes. These are just anecdotes based on my personal experience, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to talk about the first time I was involved with pharmaceutical research 30 years ago, when I said I would never get involved again, and then the second time 25 years later, and I'm sure I will never get involved again. And the first time was when I worked with a drug called Amrinone, which was hoped to be a great treatment for patients with heart failure at a time when there was very little treatment for heart failure in the early 1980s. And we found that it didn't work and it had severe side effects. And when we told the company that it didn't work, they looked at the data and they asked us to take out some data points on the contractility analysis, and if we had taken them out, we would have found a spurious apparent increase in contractility, and we said we couldn't do that. There was no reason to leave out these points. So they then offered us money not to publish at all, 2 years' salary for me if we didn't publish, and we said we couldn't do that. And they then said, in that case, we're going to take you to court if you publish. And we said, well, we're going to publish anyway. So they rode back a bit and they said, well, look, before you publish, we'd like to bring a famous professor across to see you from America, an opinion leader, someone whose opinion we respected. We'd heard of him. Sorry. And he came across and he said to us, you alone are getting these results. If you publish, people will think you can't do the experiments right, your lab will be discredited, which had a more worrying effect on my boss than me. But we went ahead and published, and no sooner had we published than I was contacted by 3 American professors of cardiology, one from Arkansas, one from California, and one from Columbus, Ohio, and they each said to me, and my boss, we got results just like you. And we told Sterling Winthrop, which of course is part of Sanofi now, when we told Sterling Winthrop, they said, we'd like to bring a professor to speak to you. And they brought the same professor, and he said to each of them, you alone are getting these results. If you publish, you will be discredited. And then I presented the work at meetings, presented abstracts, and when I presented, very eminent cardiologists, professors in America and in Europe, who were paid consultants to the company, would stand up and claim that they had attempted to replicate my results but had failed. And that went on for 2 years until I pointed out at the European Society of Cardiology that a professor making this claim had been saying it for 2 years. That should have been time for him to publish his failure to replicate. He'd failed to publish, and people must now be starting to wonder whether he was a liar. And I was never challenged again, and there has been no publication in the 30 years since of failures to replicate the results. And then I published a paper on the side effects of Amrinone in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology. And the drug had horrific side effects. If you put patients on it for more than a week, 50% developed thrombocytopenia, some got eosinophilia, polycerositis. It was horrific. And I published in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology, and 10 days later I was rung by Dr. Leo Offerhaus from the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicines. And at that time, every country had its own drug licensing, in Europe had its own drug licensing body. And Dr. Offerhaus said he didn't understand my paper because he had my clinical records forms and the side effects I reported were not on them. And I said, well, I've got copies of my original forms. And he and I compared, and to cut a long story short, the company had submitted forgeries to the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicine, omitting most of the side effects. And in 1984, Sterling Winthrop admitted to the US Food and Drug Administration that in the first 1,200 patients given the drug, there had been over 1,400 life-threatening side effects, so they were withdrawing the drug worldwide. But 2 years later, I discovered that although you couldn't get this drug on a prescription from a doctor in Europe or North America, you could buy it over the counter in parts of Africa and Asia, even though at that time it had been shown that it actually increased patient mortality by about 30%. And I went to Oxfam, whose representatives had representatives in the country. They bought the drug, they had proof of purchase, went to the WHO and embarrassed the company into withdrawing the drug. But there were no sanctions against the company in this country because because their senior vice president told the Department of Health that if prosecuted for breaches of the Medicines Act, they would make sure that pharmaceutical manufacturing shut down in this country. I couldn't get the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry or the General Medical Council to act against the company or the doctors it employed that had behaved unethically. I went to major journals, BMJ, Lancet, Nature, and showed them evidence, and they said that they couldn't afford to take on a libel action from a multinational pharmaceutical company. So I took the same evidence to the Guardian newspaper, and they published a 3-page spread exposing what had happened after their lawyers said, there is no trouble defending this if we're prosecuted. Now, the problem was not just the company. I got interested in this drug because of this paper, a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. At that time, it was the only report of an increase in contractility with the drug in man. And it was a small study, 8 patients in the paper, but in fact, they only measured contractility in 6. And there was no attempt to look for a dose-response relationship. They made claims in this paper that were not substantiated by the data, and one doubts whether the paper would have been published were it not for the fact that it came from Eugene Brumwood's department at Harvard with his connection with the journal. Of course, not everyone who was named as an employee on the paper of the Harvard cardiology department worked at Harvard. There was no conflict of interest declaration to show that the 2 last authors, Davalos and Aluzzi, were actually full-time employees of Sterling Winthrop, nor that Brumwood and Grossman were paid consultants for the company. This was accompanied by an editorial from Arnold Katz, an eminent cardiologist, and I'll come back to Katz in a moment. A couple of months later, a letter appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was the first report of thrombocytopenia with this drug. And it was interesting, it was a single patient, it was interesting how he got onto the drug because his wife was a stockbroker. She saw the dramatic increase in stock price when the paper in the New England Journal appeared. She realized that this meant it must be a marvelous drug for the treatment of her husband's heart failure. She got Stanley Rubin to get it on a named patient basis, and it promptly killed him with horrific side effects. Rubin then submitted an article, not a letter, to the New England Journal of Medicine describing what had happened without telling the company, and within 48 hours he was under pressure from the company to withdraw it. Relman maintained that he had the right to send copies of papers to anyone he liked when they were submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine. The New England Journal of Medicine then refused to publish the paper, saying that these side effects were well known, which was untrue. And what happened in the end was that they agreed to publish the letter summarizing what had happened, or the side effects, because Rubin said that he would go to the national press and expose the collusion between the New England Journal of Medicine and the company in trying to suppress this information. A couple of years later, another paper appeared from with a Sterling Winthrop drug, a congener of Amrinone called Milrinone, which also came from Brumwood's group, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that was published despite the fact that the first two referees it was sent to, including Arnold Katz, who'd done the editorial that accompanied the Amrinone paper, recommended rejection. So Relman then sent the paper to two more referees who recommended rejection, and published anyway because there was a prior agreement with the company to publish this article, whatever. Now, I wrote about this in The Lancet, and Arnold Relman accused me of making unsubstantiated allegations, but of course, what I'd claimed in The Lancet did not have important implications for the survival of patients, in which case a journal would not have bothered to check the facts. What it had was financial implications for the journal because they might be sued for libel, and in that circumstance, journals always ask to see the evidence. And I'd shown the Lancet documents which confirmed what I said was true, including statements from people like Katz, who'd been involved with all of this. Now, for those of you, some of you will recognize this little blind-ended street. It's Shattuck Street in Boston. It's opposite number 22. And behind us is the dead end. Just at number 10, of course, is the Harvard Library with the offices of the New England Journal. On the left there is the Brigham and Women's Hospital where Eugene Brumwood was Hersey Professor. And across the bridge is the Boston Children's Hospital. The bridge is important because doctors work in both hospitals. And the next story concerns Brumwood's successor, the current Hersey Professor, Joseph Lascalzo, and the Boston Children's Hospital because it concerns a device patented by the Boston Children's Hospital, invented by another professor of cardiology at Harvard, who sits on the board of the company set up to manufacture under license and market the device. The patent is owned by the Boston Children's Hospital. And I was the principal cardiologist in the MIST trial, Migraine Intervention with STARFlex Technology, a prospective randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial to evaluate efficacy of PFO closure with a STARFlex implant to prevent refractory migraine. I won't bother you with the science, but the patients were, the controls and the people who got the implant both had a general anesthetic, and then under general anesthetic they were randomized to either a sham procedure or the closure. So both woke up with a scar. It was difficult to get that through ethics committee. Here the steering committee, there's two principal investigators, Dr. Dowson, principal headache specialist, and I'm the principal cardiologist. You see the other members, Mullen, Muir, and Nightingale on the steering committee. Dr. Mullen has declared his lecture fees from NMT. It must have slipped his mind and that of Dr. Dowson to declare the fact that they were shareholders in the company facts not known to the rest of the steering committee until partway through the trial. And a paper was submitted to circulation, of course, the premier journal of the American Heart Association, the highest cited cardiology journal in the world. And the investigators, unfortunately, have been denied access to the full data by NMT Medical, the company. Even without the full data, it was obvious that it contained errors and omissions. There were questions over efficacy of the device in closing PFOs. Problems with safety had been concealed, including the fact that in some patients the device fell out, so that it lay free in the right atrium in one patient and was carried into a pulmonary artery in another, necessitating extra procedures to retrieve these. Life-threatening complications which were not declared in the paper. Conflicts of interest were not declared, including the fact that the vice president of the company helped to write the paper. When I say that, you could see it on track changes. So on one draft, he changed the abstract, the introduction, the methods, the results, the discussion, crossed out the entire conclusions and rewrote it. So I think you could say there was a conflict of interest there. The principal headache specialist, as I said, owned shares in NMT, and up to 10 investigators were paid consultants. And as a result, Dr. Nightingale and I refused the offer of authorship of this paper, even though we had drafted the original draft of the paper. And this is the paper. There are 15 authors. Those are the disclosures at the bottom. Many of the authors, I should say, were not involved in writing the paper at all. None of the authors were on the design committee. I was. I attach no blame to the last author, Tony Rickards. Tony Rickards is probably the most eminent individual on that paper, and he adds credence to it, but you can't blame him because he died 6 months before the trial started. Ethics approval was obtained in November 2004. He was not on the design committee. I was. None of the authors were. His death in 2004 did not stop him also being an author of replies to correspondence about this paper, even though Professor Loscalzo, the editor of the New England Circulation, by then knew that he had died 5 years earlier. At the end of the trial, I also discovered that my co-principal investigator had been under investigation by the GMC during the trial for falsifying research in another industry-sponsored trial, and that, in fact, just after the trial data collection was finished, he was found, the charges were found proved. That's the term they use when they say guilty at the GMC. I spoke about my misgivings about this research at TCT, which is the biggest interventional cardiology meeting in the world. And some of what I said was put online on a website, and as a result, NMT sued me for the first time, and when I spoke about it again, they sued me a couple more times. The claims for libel and slander went on for 4 years. They ended when NMT went into liquidation. They took up most of my free time during those years. My legal costs were £300,000, but recovered $200,000 from the company from security of costs. The lawyers actually acted rather more honourably than many of the doctors, because many of them reduced their fees because they said you haven't got all your money back, so they reduced their fees. But all this had the effect of silencing others with concerns about the trial results. Well, what did we find? The primary endpoint, you don't have to be a statistical whiz to work out that this is probably not statistically significant. But the important thing is not to let statistics stand in the way of a good story. You will see that out of the 147, we intended to have 150 patients, 147, you will see that out of the 147 patients, 3 of them had an implant and were migraine-free. Now, fortunately, those 3 patients, as it turned out, were all patients of doctors that were shareholders in NMT during the trial. Now, NMT should not have been able to find out who these patients were because the identities were concealed by an alphanumeric code, as you might expect. But somehow these patients managed to, their photographs and testimonials from them appeared on NMT's website on a rotating banner. Here you see Zoe Willow. People in my new job have never known me have a migraine. I'm a different person. Liz Norwood. And also on NMT's annual report. This is Alison Doughty on the cover of NMT's annual report. There was more from these 3 patients inside. There were no testimonials from the 3 patients who were migraine-free during the analysis period with a sham procedure, or from the patients who were much worse after the procedure. More worrying still is that some of this also appeared on NHS websites. Now, this is the Royal Brompton's website where Dr. Mullen, shareholder in NMT, worked, and you will see here he says, their study, the website says, their study indicates that as many as 40% of patients could have their migraine symptoms significantly relieved through interventions to close the holes in their heart. I don't think that's what we found quite. But, and Dr. Mullen says, this is significant news for migraine sufferers. For the first time, this study has shown that closing a PFO can have a substantial effect in reducing the symptoms for patients with severe migraine. And Zoe Willow says, I've now been completely cured and can live my life as a normal person. I encourage other migraine sufferers like me to go to their GPs and insist they refer them to a specialist to test whether they too have a hole in their heart. And there was a link there. You could link to NMT's own website where you could put your postcode in and find a cardiologist in this country using the STARFlex device who would put a device in your heart as a private patient. Well, what about circulation? After 18 months of badgering from me and supplying them with hundreds of pages of documents, Circulation published a 700-word correction, 4-page data supplement and a new version of the paper. But unfortunately, the correction, they insisted that Dowson, the first author, correct the paper, even though they knew by then that Dowson was appearing before the GMC for falsifying research in another industry-sponsored trial. They knew he'd submitted the original incorrect paper. They knew by then that he had a conflict of interest that he hadn't declared as a shareholder in the company. They knew other things, such as the statement that the authors had access to the data was untrue. They knew that a vice president of NMT had helped to write the paper. They didn't allow Dr. Nightingale and me to see the correction before published. And much of what we now know is proved because NMT admitted it in legal pleadings to the High Court. They're public documents which are lodged with the High Court, which NMT had to do, and they confirmed that they did not let the authors see the full data. They confirmed that a vice president of NMT changed many of the drafts of the paper. As I say, Dr. Loscalzo is editor of Circulation. He's Broomwald's successor as Hersey Professor. As I said, NMT was established in Boston to make and market the STARFlex and related devices under license from the Children's Hospital. Those devices were invented by another Harvard professor of cardiology who was on the board of both the Children's Hospital and of NMT. A number of Harvard cardiologists were receiving royalties for sales of the device, and when Circulation considered my concerns, Dr. Loscalzo's department was being funded by NMT for research, and all this is documented. So that's it. Thanks.